Welcome to our first online lecture. This week we will be looking at sensation and perception. So we will be looking at sensation and how we define that and what that means in this video. I'm then going to do different videos for each different topic. So the next video will be looking at perception and the various factors that can affect how we perceive something. We're then going to focus on vision primarily and how vision occurs. We'll then discuss hearing and then a couple of other senses. So our chemical senses, which is taste and smell, our vestibular sense, which is essentially our sense of our body in space and our balance. We'll talk about touch, we'll talk about pain, and then we'll look at how we organize information in our mind, which is perceptual organization. So starting with sensation, if you think back to when we discussed different types of neurons, I mentioned that in order for messages from the outside world to travel to the brain, they do so via sensory neurons. And in order to do that, they first have to be picked up by sensory receptors. So these sensory receptors are specialized neurons that can be found in all of our sensory organs. And that includes obviously our skin, our eyes, our ears. And so each of these receptors will respond to specific stimuli. So obviously light for our eyes and sound for our ears as examples. When we're talking about sensation, that occurs when those sensory receptors detect sensory stimuli. So when when the sensory receptors for sound in our ears pick up on sound, the moment that happens, that is sensation. Okay. When that happens, that message is sent via the central nervous system to the brain, but we haven't actually made any meaning out of that sound yet. So for example, if your phone rings, the sound of the phone will be picked up by those sensory receptors, and that will be sent to the brain, and you will hear the sound. But the point at which you know it's your phone ringing, that's perception. So that hasn't occurred yet. We are just talking right now about the moment that our sensory receptors pick up that message, send it to the brain, and we process that and we recognize that stimulus, but we haven't interpreted it yet. That part is perception. So before we get to that, let's discuss how sensation occurs. So again, thinking back to when we spoke about neurons and action potentials, in order for a message to be sent or received by the brain, neurons have to become activated and they must communicate that message between each other using electrical and chemical signals. Now, you can kind of think of those electrical and chemical signals as the language our nervous system uses to communicate. So when our sensory receptors first receive a message from the outside world, that's in another language. That is not yet in electrical and chemical signals. So for example, when sound reaches our ears, it's in the form of sound waves. Our brain can't communicate it through sound waves. It does not use that language. So before our brain can process this, it first needs to be turned into a language that the brain can understand. And that's essentially what is happening when sensation happens. When our sensory receptors first receive that message from the outside world, they transform that into electrical and chemical signals. They convert that into a message in the language that the nervous system understands, and that can then be transmitted through the peripheral nervous system to the spine and the central nervous system, and then of course up to the brain. And this is what our sensory receptors do. That is their job. They receive that incoming message, they convert it into an electrical and chemical signal, or in other words, an action potential, and that is then sent to the brain. This is called transduction. Okay, so the process of transforming stimuli into neural energy, which is electrical and chemical signals. So that is the first step in sensation, okay, transduction, turning whatever stimulus it is into something the brain that can understand, turning it into neural energy. Once that has happened, once transduction has happened in the sensory receptor, that message is then sent to the brain, and that is where we experience the sensation associated with that message. So if it's a smell, we then smell whatever it is. Again, we don't know what we're smelling yet, but we experience the sensation of smell. Or light waves get turned into neural energy, which allow us to then see the image that we are looking at. But again, we haven't made any meaning out of that yet. It is just the physical sensation. So the question that we need to ask is, what determines whether we sense something or not? Obviously, there are lots of variations in our ability to sense things. Some people have better hearing than others. Some people have better sight. But even between species, this varies. You know, dogs can hear sounds, or they can hear pitches that as humans, we don't have the ability to hear. So part of it is biological. The reality is our senses have certain limits, and in order for our senses to notice something, there has to be enough of that something to detect. And that amount that is needed is what we call an absolute threshold. So the minimum amount of a stimulus that must be present for it to be detected at least 50% of the time. So just the smallest amount that we need in order to experience that sensation, in order to detect that stimulus, or the point at which it's strong enough for us to detect that. Now, it used to just be simply defined as the smallest amount needed to be detected in general, but research then found that there are a lot of factors that could influence whether a stimulus is detected or not. Plus, that ability, as I just mentioned, also differs between individuals. Some of you have better eyesight than others. And so that is why the definition was changed to be that it needs to be detected at least 50% of the time. So what that means, if we go to this example for vision, the absolute threshold is a candle flame seen from 30 miles away on a clear, dark night. So when we say that, what we mean is that that is the minimum amount of light needed for people to detect it. Obviously, not everyone will be able to detect that, and even if you can, sometimes there will be other times where maybe you're tired and your eyes aren't working quite as well, where you might not, but at least 50% of the time, that amount of light can be detected. Now, if the stimulus is below the threshold, so if it does not meet the absolute threshold, sensory receptors are not activated, and it will not be sensed. This is what is called, if stimulus is below the threshold, this is when we call that subliminal. So you may have heard of subliminal messaging, and there's this idea that, you know, advertisers can use this to change our behavior. That is not true. The information is still received by the brain. It's just that we are not consciously aware of it. That sensation doesn't occur. We're not consciously aware of that sensation happening. So while our brain might detect it and it might respond to it, there is no way that it can influence our behavior because we're not consciously aware of it. And in order for it to influence our behavior, we need to have that conscious awareness. So that doesn't actually happen. But now you know what we mean when we talk about subliminal messaging. Information that is below the absolute threshold for that sense, and so we therefore do not detect it. And that concludes our short video on sensation. In the next one, we'll be looking at perception, and specifically looking at various factors that can influence whether or not we do perceive something and how we perceive things.